Well, it's really a pleasure to host Dr. Nancy Olivieri on the Healthcare Unfiltered podcast. Nancy and I have met several months ago as part of a collaborative research work that we do together with the University of South Carolina. And I was just completely fascinated by some background story that Nancy was involved in where there's really, I'm not gonna give you, I'm not gonna spoil the plot for you, but you're gonna hear a story that is rather fascinating. I would say it's on the intersection of pharmaceutical greed and academic lack of integrity, whatever we're gonna call it. Nancy will tell us. Nancy, Dr. Olivieri, welcome to the show. I really appreciate you taking the time of your busy schedule. And I know you're doing this after your second shot of the Pfizer vaccine, where we had to postpone our taping because you got ill yesterday.
God, yeah, I didn't have a good reaction, but I had more of a reaction than I thought. But Shadi, I'm really pleased to be here. I'm really grateful. I'm excited to talk to you on this wonderful podcast. Thanks for asking me.
So you're feeling better. I want to make sure whatever you say.
I feel great. Yeah, I feel great. Everybody, I feel great.
So just a little bit before we start about your story and what you went through over the past several decades, a little bit about you and who you are and where you worked and are you currently working? Just tell us a little bit about you.
Sure. So I'm Canadian. I graduated from McMaster University Medical School 78, grade class. I went on to training in internal medicine and hematology. And in 1986, I came back from Boston to take up a position as the director of the thalassemia and leader of the sickle cell disease programs at the Hospital for Sick Children in Toronto, where I worked for the next 25 years until, as we'll hear, I left Sick Kids. And I'm currently at the University Health Network, which is the adult hospital right across the street from Sick Kids, still at the University of Toronto, professor of medicine, pediatrics, and public health sciences there. And I'm still working in Sri Lanka. I formed a charity called Hemoglobal, which works with thalassemia in Sri Lanka and Calcutta, India. And I don't do a whole lot of clinical work locally in Toronto any longer.
Okay, so you divide your work between, you do more research and administration, and some of the clinical work is more global work outside of the US?
That's right.
So Nancy, I want to go down memory lane with you into something happened in the 80s where you were 80s or 90s or somewhere back there when you were doing clinical trial and something happened. Take listeners through how did this all start? Because I want to take the story gradually.
Okay, so it was a different time in clinical trials. And what I read in the BMJ was an article about an orally active iron chelator, because thalassemia patients get transfused every month and they accumulate tissue iron, and they need to take a drug called a chelator to remove iron. Okay, so I call up the people in England and they're not interested in collaborating. So I go to the University of Toronto and I ask my colleague in chemistry if he can make this orally active drug. And he says, it's simple enough. You could make it in your bathtub. He makes it for me free and he encapsulates it for me. And we get permission from Health Canada and what's called then the Medical Research Council of Canada, which was public funding like the NIH, to do a trial in thalassemia patients and compare it to the standard therapy. Now, the standard therapy was needles infused 12 hours a night. So everybody was seeking an orally active drug. So the trials went on, and they went on for about 4 years. And then the first publication was in the New England Journal in 1995, and it was favorable. We were terribly excited. My colleague, Gary Brittenham, then at Case Western, now at Columbia, and I did these trials in parallel. And he was, the person who looked at all the iron levels and measured them. And then about a year and a half later, right about the time
so just the 1995 paper was the culmination of your own work of the drug that you manufactured.
That's right, it was, and it was all publicly funded. And then about 6 months before that, a drug company headed by a CEO named Barry Sherman had wanted to get in, and we applied for more funding, and the Medical Research Council said you need a pharmaceutical partner. That was when it was starting to happen, that you needed to have commercial support. And this gentleman, Barry Sherman, agreed to partly fund the trials. He still was supplementing public funds. And then about 8 months after that, I said to Gary, and Gary agreed with me, that we were looking at some inadequate effectiveness and some toxicity of the drug. And we told the Research Ethics Board at the Hospital for Sick Children that we were finding this. And they said, well, you have to revise the consent forms and you have to tell the patients, which we said, great. So we made up the consent forms on the May 21st, 1996. I sent those, and I sent them to the CEO in question as well, Barry Sherman, the head of this drug company who was partly funding the trial. And on May 24th, 1996, I got a letter and a voicemail saying, if you tell patients, parents, regulatory agencies, or the scientific community about your concerns, you will be served with all legal remedies.
What were your concerns, though, and where did the concerns?
Okay, so where did
the concerns come from?
Well, our concerns came from the fact that everything in thalassemia is measured. The life-limiting complication is iron overload. So if liver iron start exceeding 7, and particularly 15 milligrams per gram dry weight of tissue, then you end up getting cardiac disease, glucose intolerance, and premature death. And these were not levels that anybody had made up. These had been defined years and years before. They were not controversial levels. So I take a look and I say to Gary, but look, patient X has gone from X to 15. Yeah. The next patient had done the same. The next patient. So we were saying, well, this doesn't look like it's working anymore. It had worked at the beginning and we published a paper and everything had gone down significantly. But now it seemed that those levels were either rising or not being maintained at the level we needed them at. So we tell the Research Ethics Board, I must say, its first chair was exemplary in his conduct. He said, you don't have any choice. Just give me those forms. I need the revised consent forms. And we gave them to him. And then 3 days later, all this happened. Now, the first person I called, well, not the first, but probably the second. I think the first person I called was Gary, but the second person I called was the Dean of Medicine. And the Dean of Medicine at the University of Toronto said, well, they can stop the studies. What's the problem? I said, well, there's a problem because first of all, they're publicly funded these trials. Secondly, we've got to disseminate these concerns, and they're saying we can't. And if we do, we're going to be served with a lawsuit. And there followed kind of a, well,
so you wanted to modify the consent form.
Exactly. That's the key, Chatty. Right. Everybody says, oh, you wanted to stop the trial? I said, I'm not the people who stopped the trial. In the same letter, the guy says we're stopping the trials. We didn't want to stop the trials because not everybody was not benefiting from this drug. There were people, about a third of them, who looked like they were doing well. So we had all kinds of, it seems ridiculous now, but all these hypotheses that we presented to the drug company, in which we proceeded to propose to explore whether it was compliance, whether it was vitamin C levels. These are all things that might be relevant in the response to a chelator. And we had all these fairly scientifically based ideas to do this. And they said, we're stopping the trials. And we are, by the way, telling you, if you say anything, that'll be the, and so we didn't have any money.
So you wanted to modify the consent. You went to the Research Ethics Committee, you went to the Dean, and you said, I want to modify the consent. And then how did the pharma company learn that you were trying to modify the consent?
I sent them the consents. I sent them. I said, I'm sending these guys the consents. These are the consents. They're going out this week to all the other patients. And it explains what we found and explains why we want to continue. And please, because we were really proceeding in an effort to be transparent and open. I don't know why we thought we could be, but anyway, we did. And that's when
they sent you like a threatening letter.
Oh, it was, unfortunately, it was voicemailed and tape recorded. Because if it hadn't been tape recorded, and I don't want to fast forward, there were lots of subsequent denials on the basis of the CEO who said he hadn't said that. But fortunately, when you got the tape, you got the tape. Anyway, yeah, it said that. And so I sought help through the academic institutions. But the little twist in the story was, and I'm going to be careful how I say this, I'm going to say it just the way Arthur Schaefer said it in a very long, probably the longest journal of medical ethics article that's ever been written. He said, some were led to speculate that the academic institutions' unwillingness to support academic freedom and patient protection were not unconnected to the university's expectation of money from the same pharma CEO. And at the time that this all happened, the very month that this was happening, the University of Toronto was expecting a donation that was larger than any donation it had ever received from the pharma CEO in question. So they were not exactly greeting my and Gary's concerns with open arms. They were Like, what the hell? And sorry, I don't know if I can say hell on this.
You know, it's
And,
Healthcare Unfiltered. You can curse, you can say whatever you want.
okay.
Drop F-bombs, whatever you want.
Anyway, I think Arthur's paragraph is perfect. Some were led to speculate that this was not unconnected. So we kind of didn't know this at the beginning. We actually, believe it or not, thought we'd take it to the dean and he'd say, that's outrageous. There is no pharmacy CEO that can permit you not to tell the patients what you need to tell them and to publish. And that was the first 2 years of it, back and forth, trying to say that it was a scientific controversy. And the reason they said it was a scientific controversy, and this is where it kind of gets confusing, is there was a pharmacologist named Gideon Coren who was involved in the trials at the beginning. The reason I bring him up is he kind of comes into the thing a little later when John Le Carre read about this story, and he might have just passed it by, except for this twist.
Who is John Le Carre?
Well, John Le Carre is a thriller writer, and he wrote a book called The Constant Gardener, loosely based fictionally on this story. And one of the reasons that John Le Carre wrote this story was because of the twists and turns in the academic community that happened, which we don't need to get into now. The real meat of the whole thing is that, but if you do want to pick up The Constant Gardener, it's a good synthesis. It's probably the only book John Le Carre ever wrote on the pharmaceutical industry and its machinations. So we go on and we prepare abstracts to present at ASH, to prepare at the Cooley's Anemia Foundation meetings that outline
what
these.
What year are
now we're up to about 1997.
Uh-huh.
And we get threats every time. The threats continue. If you appear at this meeting, you will be served with all legal remedies. So eventually, not so eventually, pretty immediately, I got protection from something called this Canadian Medical Protective Association, who decided that they would defend our right to disseminate the information in a scientific journal. So in 1998, fast forwarding a little, I got our second paper outlined the problems with deferiprone, again in the New England Journal. And that's really when, believe it or not, our problems escalated. And that's when the university did not fire me, but the other academic institution, the hospital, kept dismissing me. There's a lot of backstory here.
What's the drug again? Say the drug again, Nancy.
The drug is deferiprone. It's an orally active iron chelator that binds iron and promotes its excretion in patients who are iron loaded.
So in 1998, you published another paper after the 1995 where you described concerns that you had.
The problems, right.
And then after the publication of that paper, one of the institutions fired you?
No, repeatedly, I was dismissed from my position as the head of the hemoglobinopathy program. Coming from one of these internal investigations appointed by the Hospital for Sick Children called the NAMARC report, which was headed by 3 ethicists or scientists, NAMARC, Bartha Knoppers, and Fred Lowy. And they took several hundred pages to record that if anyone was at fault, it was me, because I hadn't done X or Y, and you'd have to read the NAMARC report to figure it out because it's been discredited. But as a result of the NAMARC report, I was referred to the College of Physicians and Surgeons, the Canadian licensing body, in an effort to remove my license. Now, that was a hairy time because, of course, I didn't really want to lose my medical license. But fortunately, after a year and a half, the College for Physicians and Surgeons said, "Are you kidding me? Like, there's nothing this person did wrong. There's everything she did right."
What was the basis like? Why did they want to remove your license? What was I can't read the entire report, but what was like?
I know, it's very, well, the basis of this was they claimed that I had known about the toxicity, which of course they denied existed. It's kind of like that Groucho Marx thing where he says the food here is so terrible in such small portions. I always say that because they said there's no toxicity at all. And by the way, you didn't tell the patients on time. I'm like, well, first of all, you said there was no toxicity. And secondly, I did tell the patients, but you guys said you wouldn't help me with the lawsuit. So yes, there was, anyway, the point was, this was the accusation. But of course you can't read the report, but the CPSO took a year and a half to say, what are you smoking? There's no problem here. She did everything right. That was commendable. And about that time, also co-released was a 500 report called the Olivieri report by the Canadian Association of University Teachers, which outlined everything that had happened between 1995 and 2001. It was released in the fall of 2001. And it was proof that you need an association of university teachers. I should be paying the University Teachers Association for the rest of my life because of that, because it was headed by 3 unpaid academics who worked for 2 years with all the documents and found what the Neymark report had tried to cover up. So in the fall of 2001, I got those 2 acquittals, if you will, Chatty. I got an acquittal from the college, which said nothing she did was wrong and we're not taking away her license. So that's, sorry about that. And I got this big report. But then the problem is that just around that time, I got a brown paper envelope handed to me in Australia. And it showed that
Australia, what, for vacation or something?
No, I was talking at some conference, and I'm grateful I was too, because the guy ran off, it's a guy, and in it was the application to the European regulator for deferiprone by the CEO. And in that, the CEO alleged that I had committed so many protocol violations that nothing I could say about these trials could be believed. So when that happens, I think everybody here would be afraid that you would be labeled, as my lawyer once said, a science of almost breathtaking incompetence, is what the company accused me of. So I sued the European regulator and said, you can't rely on these data because they were my data and I know what the data showed. So I issued, it was Olivieri versus the Commission and the EMEA. And we went to court early in 2000 or 2001. And the Danish judge heard us and said, I know this is getting a little complicated, so pull me back if I'm going down a rabbit hole. But he said, I'd like to see all the protocol violations that Dr. Olivieri allegedly committed. And the other side said, well, no, we can't show them to you. And he said, I'm the judge and I get to see what everything is. So send it to me. And on my birthday in 2000, I remember because it arrived on my birthday, he sent me this and said, what the hell? And then I had to commission somebody whose name you might know, but a lot of drug relators would know him, named Graham Dukes, who did a 7-month audit of my trial and found that there were very few protocol violations, none in the primary endpoint, and 2 delayed serum ferritin concentrations. And he said, this trial was conducted robustly and there are no basis to this. So then the EMEA had a problem because they were relying on what they understood was an unreliable investigator, and they had believed the company's CEO. However, now it was all turned on its head. They licensed the drug as a last resort.
Before we do the licensing, before we get to the verdict,
sure.
You after you published your stuff and you got all of these issues, this thing was not being filed for approval in the US, was still the CEO.
No, we're still a long way from there.
Yeah,
but that's a story.
We're still in the EU trying to file for approval for the EU, and somebody like a good Samaritan handed you an envelope and told you this is what they're trying to do. And then when you say you sued them, Nancy, and I mean, are you paying out of your pocket money for these lawyers? These lawyers are.
Oh my God, I must have spent $5 million. I don't know how I did. I had a friend who did something similar at Health Canada, and she said, they don't know how I'm surviving. And then she paused and said, I don't know how I'm surviving. Well, I didn't have anything at that time, right? I didn't have, I had a tiny house. I didn't have a family. I didn't have a kid. I didn't have any real responsibilities. And my lawyers were patient in taking the money month by month. They were unbelievable. I know people have had bad experience with lawyers and people glibly say, oh, lawyers make things worse. But my lawyers always made things better. My European lawyers, my labor lawyers in Canada.
But you paid out of pocket. The bottom line is you paid out of pocket for these lawyers.
Yeah.
And you felt strongly that you're going to, frankly, a lot of people may not be able to afford.
I know. The
lawyers who are listening to this podcast, your lawyers make a lot of money. I'm just, because I have a lot of lawyers that listen to my podcast, and I want to make sure they know that they make a lot of money. So then a Danish judge was basically supervising the case.
He took the first hearing in Luxembourg in 2001, I think. And he said, I'd like to know just how incompetent this scientist is. If you're claiming her data are wrong, then I need to know how wrong. And of course, because he was the judge, he got the pleadings and every detail of that. And I can still remember, Chatty, it was 3,160. The 60 kills me. Protocol violations. And so that's when we went to Professor Graham Dukes, who was both a lawyer, a doctor, and a former member of the CMP, the European regulator. Yeah. And he took an audit and he said, nonsense. There's nothing wrong with these trials. These trials are conducted. So then the EMEA, the European regulator, went ahead and licensed it, but for second line therapy. They were also very, very far into this. They hadn't expected, this was the first, and I believe the last time anybody as a citizen challenged the FDA, because it was a little bit different in those days, right?
FDA or EMA? I'm confused. I thought we're still
the EMEA. The EMEA is the
you said FDA.
It's essentially the European FDA, the regulator, right?
Yeah.
So that was the first time, I believe the last time anybody had done that, because the reason they can't do it now, as you well know, and I well know, is a lot of these trials are more opaque now because they're run by pharma. My trial had started, I could tell you the birth date of every one of my patients, and I could tell you exactly what their ferritin was on a certain day and what the liver iron had had. No one could tell me anything about those data that I didn't know. So that's rare now because you're handling multi-center trials and pharma's kind of running the stuff, and Graham Dukes told me stuff that would just curl your hair about it. But the point is that I don't think people would do it now because they wouldn't have the knowledge to say, wait a minute, that's not what my data show. That's not what my data show. So anyway, then the trial took 5 years, and we were in Luxembourg again.
5 years.
Yeah, 5 years. It went on, and in December 2003, well, from the first filing, and we got a notice that said it's thrown out on standing. We were heard in early 2003, and I remember a very famous, in the trial, or not in the trial, but in the hearing, a tribunal, 3 judges, not the Danish judge this time, Spanish judge, a Swedish judge, and I forget who else, said, what's happening with the FDA? And I said, the FDA is still looking for animal studies in this drug. And then there was this awkward pause in the Luxembourg court, and he said, you're asking for licensing of this drug in Europe, while the Americans are looking at studies in rats? And I remember my lawyer turning around and saying, I think this is going well. Anyway, it was going well. And then in December 2003, we got a notice saying it's dismissed on standing. Now, standing, for the lawyers are going to understand this listening to your podcast, but for the others, standing is a requirement to have legal recourse to actually bring it. So if I see you run over by a car, I can't bring a lawsuit on your behalf because I feel that you're a doctor and I'm a doctor and I'm offended by the fact that you were run down. I have to have some legal recourse to do that. So they said, well, you're not a European and you're not a patient with thalassemia, so you have no standing. So it took 5 years not to consider the merits of this case. So a lot of the time when this story is told and retold, they say, but the European court didn't find anything. And I have to say, the decision was on standing, not on merits. And had it been on merits, they would have looked at it and I believe found that that was not what the data showed. But that said, that would brings us up to about 2003.
So it got approved in Europe, though.
It is approved as a last resort. Yes.
It got approved in 01, between 01 and 05?
It got approved finally, I think, in 01.
In 01.
Yeah.
And then, it was, so you basically couldn't stop the approval.
No, I couldn't. I couldn't stop it. And that reminds me of my FDA experience, but I don't have to go on to that right away, but it kind of does tie in. And about 10 years later, the same CEO makes the plea to the FDA that I'm an incompetent scientist and should.
So what happened though between 01 and 011? Because
I'm not allowed to say, but there was a lot of defamation and libel going on.
Okay.
And I had to fight on several fronts. And I settled with the university and hospital. And
you and university got into a lawsuit about this?
Well,
whatever you can share. I know you can share.
Yeah, we kind of got into several lawsuits, and most of them, although not all, were settled between 2000 and 2010. There were 2 outstanding lawsuits in 2012 and 2014 that were settled. And the 14 one was with the CEO, who had, well, he had kind of libeled me on 60 Minutes. So I sued him for libel, and that took.
So for those of our listening who have no idea what libel is, what are we talking about?
Well, we're talking about a statement about someone who brings them into ill repute or shame that is false. The defense to me saying something about you is that I could say, well, it's true. That would not prevent you from suing me, but it would be the ultimate defense. Truth is the defense to libel. If you say someone is crazy or unhinged or destructive, you have to be able to prove it in court if they sue you for that statement. I guess it's slander if they say it and libel if they write it. But anyway, on 60 Minutes, it was quite an accusation to an astonished Leslie Stahl. And the reason I bring all this up is because it kind of entered into the lawsuits of the next decade as well, because the libel lawsuit that I issued against the CEO, who met a violent and mysterious death 3 years ago. God, this story just doesn't end. But before he died, the settlement for the libel had occurred, but it had taken 15 years from the original 60 Minutes episode. I know I'm probably confusing your listeners, aren't I?
Well, I'm trying just to look at the time frame because I want to make sure I'm trying to have a chronological order of sequence of events. We got to the Europe and it got approved in Europe despite the lawsuit. And the lawsuit was dismissed based on, not based on merits, based on.
That's right. Based on standing. It's a very important distinction.
Right. After that, though, you had some lawsuits between you and the institutions. To the extent you can share, I'm confused. What were the merits of the lawsuits with the institutions and the universities that you were working at?
Well, the primary lawsuit were the SLAPP lawsuits issued by the CEO of the pharma company. There really were no, after the college referral failed, on the basis, after the academic institutions referred me to the college and that failed, there were just a series of attempts to reconcile with myself and my 4 colleagues, all of whom were quite distinguished people. And they deserve to be brought into the story because in most whistleblower stories, the people are often alone or they have one friend but extraordinarily in my case, and there was actually a Journal of Medical Ethics article written by Françoise Baylis about this, and it was called The Olivieri Debacle, Where Were the Heroes of Bioethics? And what it outlines is that I had 4 friends at Sick Kids, no more than 4, but 4, who kind of ruined their lives, Chatty, for 20 years for me. And we would have meetings, we would have conferences, we would go to the university, we would go to the hospital, we would go to the dean, we would go to the provost together, separately, 2 of us, 8 of us, 4 of us. And they led, and it was very difficult, therefore, for the university to just shove off and try to dismiss me because they had to dismiss 5 of us. And so it's really important to understand that if you ever hear this story and somebody is struggling, that even in email or I'll come to a meeting with you if you need my help, may change the course of the person's struggle. Anyway, it wasn't really so much lawsuits between 2000 and 2010, Chatty. It was more that we were demanding settlements on what had happened to my colleagues. Some of them had become quite ill during this time, trying to struggle with me. I wasn't ill myself, but they had been, one of them had become ill. And the issue really was the lawsuits contained in one thing I can't talk about, which was kind of a major explosion in the middle of 2005 that involved the university, about which I can't speak right now. And then, of course, the ongoing onslaughts from the pharma CEO who put, SLAPP lawsuits. These are lawsuits against public policy, and they are aimed at shutting you up. And a lot of this has been made public, and those lawsuits proceeded to be settled. And one of the problems with the libel lawsuit is that we obtained a settlement, but then the CEO refused to agree to the terms of the settlement. So we had to go to the Court of Appeal, which is the second court. I mean, most of the decade between 2000 and 2010, I spent in discovery and court and with lawyers. I should have paid rent to there. But anyway, that kind of settled at the end of 2014. But
Okay.
in the meantime,
And when you refer to the CEO, you're looking at the CEO of the company.
yeah, the CEO of the company,
So that settled in 2014.
late 2014.
And then at that time, were the FDA submissions were ongoing for approval?
Okay, so the FDA, I get a call from the FDA in 2009 saying they're coming for an inspection. And I say, I am so happy I could die. And the guy says, you're happy about an FDA inspection? I said, oh my God, this is going to be the best week of my life. So what happens is the FDA was similarly told by the CEO that I was a scientist of breathtaking incompetence, but instead of believing the CEO, as Europe had, the FDA said, no, I don't think so. We're going to come up for an inspection. And you know how rare these inspections are. They're even rarer for sites in Canada for trials that have been stopped 13 years before. But I had preserved everything. I had never taken off my desk any of the CRFs. They were stacked in behind my desk in the perfect order on the day, May 24th, 1996, that the trials had been abruptly terminated by the CEO. So the FDA comes up and I am just so thrilled. I can't believe it's the best week of my life. And she goes through what she's been given and she realizes that what she's been given, this is all on the public record because Public Citizen, Sid Wolf and Michael Karomi wrote a long letter about this. So I'm not saying anything out of turn. She realized that what were in my CRFs differed substantially from what the FDA had received. So she looks at them and says, well, Chatty, he had a liver iron of 15. I said, no, liver iron of 4. And here's his last CRF. See, she says, She went through that. It took a week. And 2 months later, the advisory committee on this drug was shut down abruptly. And I visited the FDA and explained what had happened. And they were pretty much ticked off. They weren't happy about this because she had probably told them, listen, this woman is anything but crazy and all the data are still there. My father saved everything. That's why I save everything. So it was just as if the trial had stopped the day before. And so then the FDA issued
and the trial was stopped because the FDA mandated the stoppage of the trial?
No. The trial had been stopped 13 years before. The CEO had said, I'm stopping the trial. Remember that?
Right, but to apply.
And then I'd saved everything. And then when he applied 13 years later for FDA approval, the FDA says, well, what's happening?
So he applied 13 years later based on
13 years later.
Based on the old data. There was no new trial. Okay.
That's right. I mean, that's right. And so he said, but you need to ignore it because she committed 3,160 protocol violations. And so the FDA, again, didn't really believe this, I don't think. It's hard to believe anybody is that bad, a scientist. So they come up and they inspect the trials and they find that not to be supported. And they also find the level of concern that I'd expressed and some evidence for why, and some of the liver irons were in the CRFs. And so she was able to observe what I had been struggling to tell them and Europe. And so she goes back to the FDA and the FDA shuts down the advisory committee.
Got it.
And then everybody's really mad, especially at me. But then the FDA issues a letter that says, well, look, there are no data. So we would like you to conduct another trial. I mean, given that the first one, including I had a randomized trial going on as well, that was also shut down, including the fact that these 2 trials were shut down. We don't have any data any longer. So how about we look at least one randomized controlled trial of this drug's effectiveness? And he said, no, let's go with a composite of 12 or 16 trials looking at serum ferritin, which, as you know, is a surrogate marker. It brings up the whole approval of the Alzheimer's drug this week on surrogate markers. And the FDA—
So you wanted to do like a meta-analysis or like?
He didn't do a meta-analysis. He included several studies, mainly industry-funded studies, that had looked at something called the serum ferritin, not a liver iron. Liver iron is the quantitative assessment of body iron burden. The serum ferritin is a surrogate marker of body iron burden. And it's a little bit too complicated to explain, but it was, they said, let's put it all together. Now, I want to tell you before you start scratching your head that one of the people who published an article on this called How Low Can You Go? Asked Richard Pazdur of the FDA, has any drug ever been licensed on such low quality data? And he replied, no. I hope this doesn't establish a precedent. So there you go. So I'm just quoting people now because those are in the public domain. So then
I was going to say, now the FDA shut the advisory panel
for 2 years.
For 2 years. So we're now like what, 014, 015?
No, 2012.
We're 2012. And then what happened? Did they reopen it back? What happened after 20?
Yeah, they approved the drug as last resort. The Cochrane calls it last.
Based on what?
Based on the surrogate marker 16 trial thing. I mean, you and I have seen the Alzheimer approval this week, so we shouldn't be drinking in response to this, but now I feel like a drink. Yeah, so on the surrogate marker, and the FDA said there's no evidence of clinical effect from this drug. Now, if you tell a layperson this, they say, oh, this person must be delusional, because the FDA would never, ever license something on the basis of no clinical effect. And I'm sorry to say that that is exactly what even the product monograph says. So, I mean, you know, and people say things to me like the FDA is going to prove it. Mind you, I used to say this stuff too. My students say this all the time. Well, the FDA will prove it. And I say, don't make me kill you. Of course, that's not going to happen, because now I know that the FDA approval, you know, may mean something in some cases, but in some cases it doesn't. So this is what happened. I'm not using the term last resort lightly. It's what the Cochrane in 2013 reported with respect to deferiprone, a last resort therapy. And they said, we see no reason to change direction in therapy based on this. So they were quite clear. And so
that's in 2013, it's approved as a last resort for patients with thalassemia major that are requiring transfusions, obviously.
That's right.
2013 and beyond, what happened after that? And,
well,
and the institution participation in all of this has been the same, like, you know, they're just no issue.
Well, by this time, Chadi, you know, the university has kind of exited the scene and it's sort of operating on its own, right? I mean, we're at the FDA. They're not happy. Unlike me, they're not happy the FDA came up to inspect, but I am thrilled beyond belief. It really was a game changer. And well, Sid Wolf and Michael Karomi from Public Citizen write a big letter to Wolcott, the FDA commissioner, saying, you cannot license this drug. And they hold a press conference saying, you cannot license this drug. Naturally, the FDA licenses it. Now we're up to 2013, the Cochrane writes a report. And in 2014, we're still in court, but we finally reach mandatory mediation with the drug company CEO, and we settle. That's all I can say, really. Mm-hmm. And then what happens is that I get told by a lot of patients, I'm still in contact with my patients because I kind of grew up with them, because in 1982, when you were probably not even born, I went to SickKids as a heme fellow, and I met all these people who were expecting to die at 18 and 20, but because iron chelation therapy had been introduced by David Nathan in Boston 4 years before, and they had gone down to get this, they're still alive today, most of them. So we can thank him for that. But the point, I guess, is that I knew these patients. I'd known them for 40 years. So they start telling me, but they told me I have to go on deferiprone. I said, what the hell do you mean you have to go on deferiprone? Aren't you on X? And in the middle of this, Chadi, Novartis licenses a drug called Xjade, which is also an orally active chelator. And it is non-inferior to Desferal, ruled non-inferior. And I've used it quite a bit in Sri Lanka, and I'm making no plug for it, but it's a reasonably, it's an adequate and effective drug. And so that was what I was expecting my patients to go on in the middle of the 2000s. And yet in the university, in the hospital where I am, they were being placed on, this is around 2010, a lot of deferiprone. So they said, what the hell's going on? Well, why? And it turns out that it hadn't been licensed yet in Canada. And one of the physicians at the University Health Network undertook to switch several patients, 71, which is about half the locally transfused group, from standard treatment with 2 iron chelators to deferiprone. And I published a paper. I brought this to the attention of the University Health Network about 1,000 times between 2010 and 2019. And finally, 2019, after I'd worked on the data for 5 years, I published a paper in PLOS that showed what had happened during the exposure of this drug to the patients for whom I had consent to do this look-back study. And it was quite a serious series of complications. in which patients had developed new diabetes. Diabetes is a complication of uncontrolled iron, had developed serious liver inflammation or dysfunction. And then we told the UHN, so that was published in the local paper called A Frightening Scandal, because it wasn't clear that these patients had even undergone this evaluation in the context of a clinical trial. Don't forget, during the time I was doing this, or maybe I didn't tell you this, it was not a licensed drug in Canada. So what was happening at the University Health Network was an unlicensed drug was being administered to half the locally transfused patients. And my colleague Brenda Galley and I kept asking, well, why? How could this happen? Where's the clinical trial reports? Where's the consent forms? And we got nowhere. So finally we published this paper. And it kind of made a bit of a alarm system go off. And since that time, there was a so-called internal review that said there was no problem, that 71 patients had been given unlicensed therapy, but it was all okay. And as soon as the 6 years were up, the drug was licensed at Health Canada.
Got it.
So
when was it approved in Health Canada?
2015, about, what is that? That's about 20 years after this, after the whole story that I've told you in a very confusing way possibly started. So we're still in the middle of this, Chadi. We're still, Arthur Schaefer wrote
Why?
second.
Like 6 years since it was approved. What's going on now?
Well, what's going on now is we're trying to figure out why these people were given a non-approved drug.
I see.
Under the circumstances in which we can't find any informed consent forms. We've gone to the Research Ethics Board of several times, and we keep getting stonewalled. We're stonewalled at every turn. And about March of 2020, just as COVID broke, 88 scientists, ethicists, researchers sent a letter to UHN saying Dr. Olivieri should be able to tell the patients what happened in this case and what about informed consent and why they were switched to unlicensed therapy. And we support this transparency very greatly. And we never got a letter in response to that. So we set up a website called inthepatientsinterest.org that sort of, it's mainly the letters that I've written to the University Health Network over the past 2 years saying, how could you give an unlicensed drug to people if you didn't have informed consent or a clinical trial? And so this is kind of a scandal upon a scandal. And people say, didn't this happen like 20 years ago? I said, well, no, not exactly. It's sort of a new scandal. And since that time, so we've been to the European Court, they've taken me to the college, that failed. We've been to the FDA acted very diligently at one point and then not so diligently at the end. And, it just, everything has kind of snowballed. And it's kind of just the whole failure of accountability in this case.
So there's a lot that we covered
I know.
in terms of what we are talking about. I hope listeners were able to, they probably need to have like a pen and paper to write the sequence.
I'm sure they're confused.
Yeah.
I would be.
But what I want to do in the last 10 minutes, Nancy, is to kind of just try to really pick your brains into what you've learned over these past 30 years. You've been dealing with this for almost 30 years. You've dealt with pharma, you've dealt with the CEO, you've dealt with your own academic institutions, you've dealt with the FDA, you've dealt with the European Regulatory Authority, you've dealt with the court system in the US, you've dealt with the court system in Europe. So it's fair to say that you have dealt with so many aspects of the legal system, the academic system, and the pharmaceutical industry. So at least in my simple brain, I'm trying to decipher all of this complicated story into few lessons learned, into what's your observations. I guess let's talk about how, in your experience in dealing with the academic community, I want to start with university, deans, chairs, whatever you dealt with over the past 25 years, throughout your experience, what are the lessons learned from that particular aspect? And then I want to move to pharma. But tell me about your observations, lessons learned from what you've learned from dealing with the academic community.
Well, Chadi, I'll start with my colleagues. Again, I just want to give them a shout out because most people are silent. They don't even look at you. Your whole Christmas card list changes, and they're not interested in you, and they try to sideline. And if they don't want to attack you directly, they just move away. So I must say that I found extraordinary in the actions of 4 people. I would say more like 10 people, because there was one ethicist. So if I learned that there were people who, no matter how unattractive it seems to support you, will listen to the story somewhat reluctantly at the beginning and then say, what the hell? Okay, I'll be involved. And I don't know how to piece the commonality of those people together. In fact, it's one of the only questions I find terribly interesting, the one you've asked, which is, I used to say, what's common about these people? And a lot of people say, oh, Nancy, why is this interesting? I say, well, because this is the heart of it, really. Who helps people when they're down and right? Not down and wrong, down and right, and maybe down and wrong too. But so the upper echelons of the university, I use that term loosely, the people who have achieved positions of power and privilege, almost universally, I say almost because I'm going to say that I had highly respected colleagues in both Oxford and Harvard who helped me in an astonishing way. And it kind of put a spoke in the University of Toronto's wheels, because these people were like, no, we don't think she's crazy. No, we know she talks too fast, but we think she's completely right. We 100% agree with her. These were prominent hematologists who spoke up. So, and there were people, including in the law faculty, who were absolutely critical in reversing some of the ways we thought we were going down. So there are odd people in the university, high hierarchy, but in general, most of those people have ascended by being yes men and yes women, and they won't ever go against the university's hierarchy. So you need to rely on good people, and it's hard if you're in a state of confusion and fear to figure out who's good and who's bad. I was probably the luckiest whistleblower on earth. I had these people, and at several junctures, they were completely critical to any success we had. So I think in general, the second thing I want to just add quickly is that I had the faculty associations of both Toronto and the Canadian Association of University Teachers, and they were headed by 2 extraordinary people at the time, Bill Graham and Jim Turk, respectively, and they were just fearless. I kept waiting for them to bail, and I'd say, okay, we're going to write another book.
But you've had some of the colleagues that supported you and worked with you, but others who turned away, who did not.
Oh, many more turned away.
I want to know about leaders. I want to talk leadership. I want to talk chairs, deans.
Okay, couldn't come up with one.
Yeah,
I could come up with people outside the university, like David Nason, who was head of the Dana-Farber, and David Weatherall, who was head of the Weatherall Institute in Oxford. Those people were tireless. But local, not a person, not one person.
How about in dealing with the FDA and in dealing with the regulatory authorities in Europe? How would you describe your experience? Any lessons learned there?
I would say that, no, I would say that I saw quite quickly, I saw the inspector who came and did my trial recognize the truth of what I was saying. And I grew confident in that. But then after that, there was the process of, let's just get this through. You know, the FDA is paid 75% by pharma, and that it's quite complicit in many decisions with pharma. I didn't see any leaders in the FDA taking on anyone. Who are the leaders who have protested the FDA? Sid Wolf, Michael Karomi of A Public Citizen. They were the ones who said, what the hell is going on here? You can't license this drug. Of course, they did that unsuccessfully. So I wouldn't have identified any great shining example of integrity in either the European or the FDA or the American regulator, certainly not in the Canadian regulator as either.
How has been your experience with the legal system, whether it's the legal system in the US or the legal system in the EU?
Well, I had extraordinary lawyers, extraordinary. I had an extraordinary libel lawyer, an extraordinary labor lawyer for 12 years. She was my labor lawyer. I mean, I do think a lot of people say that, it's kind of like, Winston Churchill said about democracy. It's terrible to go to lawyers, except there's no other alternative. And sometimes you just have to go to court. And that,
if we can afford it.
Yes, this is the problem. And, we made joint contributions, and we had people helping us. And my dad helped. He was still alive, but he wasn't wealthy either. And, yes, you're right. It's terrible. And a lot of these lawyers did it on the cheap or on delay. And I'd say that it's ridiculous, but my experience with lawyers was almost completely positive.
That's good.
Because,
That's good. Hey, to all the lawyers listening, you're doing a good job. Sometimes.
Yeah, I had faith in them. I had faith, and it was returned, I think.
So let's try to ask about your experience on your reflections in dealing with the pharmaceutical industry, although this is like an N of one with one company, but how did the past 3 decades, what lessons learned are there?
Well, I think it's a pretty sad state now, as you know very well. It's kind of like it's gone with the wind. When we used to do our own trials, and Gary and I would think up a protocol and say, that's a stupid part, you take that out, or I'll take that out. That doesn't happen anymore. And what I think the public should know is that pharma manages. There's all kinds of wonderful books written about how ghost managed clinical trials are and what they really mean, which is exactly what pharma wants them to mean. So we only know about drugs what pharma wants us to know. And I have a number of ways that we could get around that, but they're complicated and cumbersome. And obviously my experience with pharma has not been a good one. But I think anybody who doesn't go along has a reasonably rocky experience with pharma. And, if you don't like being told what to do or told what the data is going to show, you're probably in for a rough ride. You might want to look at another career than a clinical investigator.
So Nancy, what's next for you? This is, by the way, it's just a fascinating story. I think it's complicated. I think it's a crazy story, but what's next for you?
Well, I want to get back to Sri Lanka and Kolkata because, thalassemia is very, very under-resourced there. You would not believe how under-resourced it is. I mean, very few people are actually even transfused, and chelators are free, but their reach is the tenders aren't. So, I mean, those are the happy times we had. For 26 years, we've been working in Sri Lanka and just talking to the people there yesterday and working on papers. That's where I really want to be.
Are you writing your experience as a book or something?
Yes, I just did.
Someone wrote a book about it, and you were not happy with that.
Well, I didn't. I was unhappy to the point of libel, Chatty. But I am writing a book. I finished my master's in fine arts and creative nonfiction at King's College, Dalhousie. Thank you to my professors and colleagues this spring. And I'm about halfway, I'm going to say 3/4 to make my mentor feel better, 3/4 of the way through the book, which kind of is a tell-all. And he keeps saying, we're getting a libel lawyer to look at this, aren't we? And I keep saying, yeah, don't worry. But we'll have to.
A publisher and everything, right?
Yes, I do.
When should we expect that coming out?
Oh, God. I joke. It's in 85th draft, probably next year.
Next year. Well, I expect a signed copy.
You'll get a free signed copy, Chatty.
Well, Nancy, I think, really, witnessing what you've done, you stood up for principle, the way I would describe this, right? I mean,
Thanks,
you stood up for principle, you stood up for the children who are on clinical trials. Was your really true north, and this is what you were trying to accomplish. Unfortunately, sometimes the system does not always honor this, and you got into this whole convoluted thing. But I would have expected, I must admit, I would have expected that your own academic institution that you worked at to be a little bit more understanding to what you were going through. Listening to you, I wasn't really impressed by the way they handled things, I admit.
It's a problem. It's a problem, and it's an ongoing problem. Not just my institution, but certainly mine. Yeah, it's a problem. A lot of people talk about rogue institutions, Chatty, but I don't know one example. There's the example of David Kern at Brown, Betty Dong at UCSF, Ignacio Capello. There's just on and on these examples go. And I don't know of one institution that ever said, hang on, pharma, hang on, biotech. We're taking our researchers' view on this and we're going to push back. I've never heard of one.
It's economics.
Mm-hmm. It's economics.
Well, Dr. Nancy Olivieri, an absolutely dynamic whistleblower with patients' interests at heart. Appreciate you coming on Healthcare Unfiltered.
I appreciate it so much, Chatty. Thanks a lot.